Welcome to My Life, Tanya Applied, with Rabbi Simon Jacobson, a journey into the deepest teachings of Torah and their application to our personal, emotional, and psychological lives.
A good tavach, a good week. We continue our journey in the life-changing Sefer Tanya, and this week we also have a special treat, as I shall share in a moment. This program is made possible by Rena Lights LLC, and it is dedicated by Wendy, Cabell, and Joseph McRae in honor of the family and loved ones, both departed and still with us. So, today, this Shabbos, was Tes Kislev, the 9th of Kislev, which is both the birthday and the yahrzeit of the Mitteler Rebbe, the son of the Baal Tanya, Rab Shneir Zalman, the author of Tanya. Tonight and tomorrow, is Yud Kislev. It's called the Chag HaGeula, the Geula of the Mitteler Rebbe. So, as a special offering, since we're talking Chassidus Tanya, let's begin talking about the Mitteler Rebbe, share a few details of his life, his person, his contribution, and a few inspiring stories that offer us different lessons, and then we'll continue in the regular series of where we're up to in Tanya. Okay, so the Mitteler Rebbe was born in the city of Lyozhne, which is Belarus, in the year Tov Kuf Lamed Daled. The English equivalent is, in the Gregorian calendar, the year 1773. Passed away 54 years later in the year Tov Kuf Peches, the English Gregorian year 1827, in the city of Nezhin, which is Ukraine. And that's where he was interred, and that's where the oil of the Mitteler Rebbe is. So he lived 54 years. Chassidim say that one of the reasons that he lived so short was because during his time, in his later years, began this terrible decree in Russia. The Tsar was called the Kichas Anshe Chayil. They were taking Jewish children, Cantonists they were known, for a lifetime, for 25 years. They were drafted into the army. And you can imagine what that caused. Children never got a chinuch, an education. And the Mitteler Rebbe actually said a mimer just shortly before his passing about it. But Agmas Nefesh. So Chassidim say that Pasha could not tolerate to see such a thing, and that's why his life was shorter than usual. On the other hand, obviously a tzaddik is a tzaddik, and everything's Ashgacha Pratis. He's the only of the Rabbeim, Chabad Rabbeim, that was born and passed away on the same day, Tes Kislev. And we know that in the world of the Gemara says that tzaddikim mamalim shneseim miyem liyem. Moshe Rabbeinu was born in Zayin Oder and passed away in Zayin Oder. Because a tzaddik is a shlemus, a complete cycle. So being born on the day and then ending your life in this world, b'chaim chiyusei ba'al medein, in the same day is a certain fullness in it. This doesn't mean other tzaddikim don't have it, but they're more beruchnis. Here it's expressed even begashmis. The Rabbeim explain the Chabad Rabbeim explain that each Rebbe, even though they're all essentially one entity, but each one had their unique shlichus, unique mission. And sometimes it's defined in terms of the Sfiris. And you could see it in their Chassidus, that the Alter Rebbe is called the Sfir of Chochmah. Let's go back a step. Baal Shem Tov and the Magid, Keser. A Keser, we know, has two components, Atik and Arich, Tainug and Rotzen. But they're two parts of one transcendent entity. Then you have Chochmah, the Alter Rebbe. And we see his Torah, especially before he was arrested, before Peterburg, as it's called, was much more brief, relatively speaking. Afterwards, he started speaking in longer language, but still Chochmah, when you compare it to the Mitteler Rebbe, the Baal Hayem Aledis, and the Baal Hayelul, and the Baal HaGeula of Tes and Yud Kislev, he's compared to Bina, the Chavas Hanor. Bina is expansiveness. And indeed, that's what you see. For every page the Alter Rebbe wrote, the Mitteler Rebbe, when he would write it down and elaborate, could be 10 pages, 5 pages. And that's the process of every intellectual system. How does it work? You start with a concept, a nukuda, a point, then you embellish on it, you flesh it out and develop it. So Chochmah is Nekuda, the Havrokas HaSeichel, the idea. The Alter Rebbe indeed was the Machadish, a Neshama Chadosh, a new soul, and he brought Chassidus Chabad into the world. The Mitteler Rebbe, based on the Maimor of the Alter Rebbe, expands. But expansion is not just a thing in quantity. It's also quality. It means going in depth and elaborating. And indeed, Chassidus explains that Bina adds things that Chochmah itself is not revealed in the Chochmah. And that's what you see in the Mitteler Rebbe's Chassidus. Another thing about the Mitteler Rebbe that was unique was the Alter Rebbe wrote, of course, Sefer Tanya, wrote Hilchos Talmud Torah, Shulchan Aruch. But all the other discourses that he delivered were delivered orally and were written down by chayzim and manichim that would listen to it, and then they would write it down. And today we have the whole body of literature from the Alter Rebbe. But most of it is not written by the Alter Rebbe himself. The Mitteler Rebbe, on the other hand, wrote almost everything himself. There's also Hanochas, but majority, and it was he published everything and gave it names. Sefer Teres Chaim, Derech Chaim, Shari Eira, Shari Tshuva, Shari Yichud, Shari Amunah, Perkei Chivrim. I'm just giving a list of a few. All these were published in the lifetime of the Mitteler Rebbe. You could see from that as well the expansion, publishing, and turning it into Svarim. The Mitteler Rebbe was organized in an organized way. Would take the Maimorim he heard from the Alter Rebbe, including his explanations on it, and published the Sidrim Dach as a classic. The Alter Rebbe would say Maimorim on different parts of Siddur. Same thing on Zohar, every Friday night for a period of time. The Mitteler Rebbe organized that and turned it into Svarim. B'Yuri Hazer, and yet another Sefer. Also interesting is that the Svarim of the Mitteler Rebbe have the word Bina in it, of Imre Bina. And Shar, Chamishim Share Bina, where you see again the emphasis on Bina. There's a few interesting facts, but for purposes of our relating to us and lessons to us, the thing to remember is that Mitteler Rebbe was Kulei Chassidus. Tzemach Tzedek, who was his son-in-law and nephew, said about Mitteler Rebbe that if you'd cut his finger, not blood wouldn't flow, Chassidus would flow. Kulei Chassidus. Everything was Chassidus. There's a story when the Mitteler Rebbe would write. He would write so quickly that when you come to the bottom of a page, he would write that the last line was cut off because it would go over on the table. And someone had to come and move to the next page. I actually saw this with my own eyes, seeing the manuscripts of the Mitteler Rebbe. You could see in many places, the last line is like cut off. You could still read it. That's a flow, a complete incessant flow of Chassidus. That the ink was still wet at the top of the page when you get to the bottom. So though every Rebbe, of course, was Kulei Chassidus, but you saw this emphasis again, Bina, the Chevus Hanor, expansiveness. They share a few interesting stories in no particular order. One, let's talk about the sensitivity of what a Rebbe is. So the story goes like this, the Frierdiker Rebbe told the story, that the Mitteler Rebbe, like all the Rabbeim, would see people in private audience, which was called Yechidus. Yeah. Once there was a long line of people who came to see the Mitteler Rebbe, and the Mitteler Rebbe patiently listened to each one, gave advice. Then one person came to the Mitteler Rebbe, and after he left the room, the Mitteler Rebbe told the secretary that he's stopping the Yechidus now, which was uncharacteristic. There was such a line of people. The Gabbai, the secretary, is listening and hears the Mitteler Rebbe inside his room is crying. So something was happening here. Later, the Mitteler Rebbe explained this uncharacteristic behavior. He said, there was a Jew that came to see me. I mean, they all came to see me, but one specifically had some problem that he was asking for a tikkun, something, how he can heal from it, how he can repair. And I could not give him eitzah. Why couldn't I give him eitzah? Because when a person asks me something, I always know I have to find it within myself. In some subtle form, I have to identify with that issue. And here was something so horrendous, I couldn't find it, even in the most shebedakos, even in the most subtle form, I couldn't find it within myself. So I couldn't continue. I couldn't give him an eitzah. So I had to stop and do introspection, soul search, until I found it within myself. And then I was able to advise him. You see, you could say a Rebbe is a Rebbe, he's a tzaddik gomur, he's b'shleimus. He's giving advice because he knows Torah, he knows Chassidus, he knows what the Eibishter wants. But to say he has to find it within himself, but that's a neshama klolis. That's what a Rebbe is. He identifies even with something that seemingly has no connection to him, but somewhere. So it's not just advice, it's a personal relating to the person. It's an empathy of the highest order. You talk about bedside manner, to use an expression. Everyone can learn from this. I've shared this story sometimes with therapists and professionals, and they're all taken by it because they always think of themselves objectively giving advice, and they're not getting immersed. But no, immersion. With the Rebbe, Mitteler Rebbe, they also say maybe about another Rebbe as well, that when people would come to see him, you couldn't see on the outside, but internally, he would sweat so deeply and profusely, they would have to change his undershirt from time to time. That's called totally connecting and totally relating. So it's not just your problem is my problem. Imagine the lesson in that. Another few interesting little different stories. There's a story they tell about Mitteler Rebbe that was a chassid, came to the Mitteler Rebbe. He was a non-chassid and he was a chashiv, a scholar, kind person. But he also felt a sense of arrogance. So he wanted the Mitteler Rebbe to give him an eitzah, what to do about his arrogance. So the Mitteler Rebbe, in his classic style, said to him, you know, when the Eibishter created the world, he created the world with teivah, a good side and a bad side. When teivah, the good and bad, came to Hashem and said, what do you want from us? So the Eibishter said, the teiv should illuminate the world with goodness. And the evil side, you should challenge it. Not because I want you to win, but I want you to challenge it so it should bring out even more goodness. So the evil side, the Yetzer Hara, said, who's going to listen to me? They hear me out Yetzer Hara. He says, you'll be called a Nachash. You'll be called a serpent. And you'll see they'll listen to you. And Kachava, Adam Achava, listened. After that, the serpent said, okay, now my identity was revealed. So Hashem says, no, we'll change your name. From now on, you'll be called the Malach HaMovis, the angel of death. Okay, and that went on for a while until Avram and Sarah began to bring godliness and light to the world again. And then the Malach HaMovis says, now I'm exposed. We'll change your name to Satan. So all the Mitteler Rebbe is telling this chassid. Okay, he gets away with that. He's able to camouflage himself with a new name. Comes Matan Torah, Moshe Rabbeinu. Now he's exposed. Okay, from now on, your name will be arrogance, gaiva, arrogance, and you'll see you'll be able to succeed. And years passed, and arrogance took the place. Basically, all the same thing, just in different shapes and forms. Dressing up in different garments, camouflaging themselves. Then came the Baal Shem Tov, says the Mitteler Rebbe. Baal Shem Tov went to war against arrogance, introduced bittul. And arrogance came to the Eibishter and said, now I no longer can do my job. The Eibishter said, no, we'll create another shape and form, another character called fear of arrogance. And you'll get away with that because everyone will say, fear of arrogance, you don't want to be arrogant. But that said the Mitteler Rebbe, no, that fear of arrogance is also arrogance. And arrogance is the Satan, and the Satan is the Malach HaMovis, and the Malach HaMovis is the Nachash, and the Nachash is the Yetzer Hara. And they're all the same thing. And the goal is not to give in to their temptations, but to rise up and withstand it and bring out even deeper strengths inside of you. Since we have limited time, I'll share one or two more other stories. The Mitteler Rebbe also said, it's gewunschen. He wished, he would say, that when two chassidim meet, two young alike, he said, when two young people meet, they should speak about, there's different Yehuda Elah and Yehuda Tata, or Das Elyon and Das Tachten, or Yireh Elah and Yireh Tata. There's different versions. But bottom line, they should talk about godliness. So that's what he wished. Again, Kulei Chassidus, that no matter what situation you're in, another word from Mitteler Rebbe, which is similar to this, that when two Jews meet, it's two nefesh alekisa and one nefesh habamis. So that's why when you join with a chavrusa and you have someone that you're learning with or speaking with, two divine souls against one animal soul. So the Rebbe once asked, 1 second, it's two divine souls against two animal souls. Why is it two against one? And the answer, brilliant answer. Ein odem chayte v'leilei. My nefesh habamis is not interested in your nefesh habamis. They're selfish. Nefesh alekis have a common interest. They both want to serve God. Nefesh habamis, what's in it for me? So it's not that we don't necessarily join. Everyone is doing their own thing. So it's 2 nefesh alekis and 1 nefesh habamis. And finally, is the famous story when the Mitteler Rebbe was Pasha Kisove, and they read the Teichacha. Teichacha is, of course, all the negative Hepach HaBrachas. Mitteler Rebbe heard the Kriya. He fainted. After he was revived, they said, "Why'd you faint?" He said, "Did you hear what the Kriya Satera? Such thing." They said, "But you hear Kriya Satera every year." I said, "When the Tata leint, Herich Nor Brachas." Every year the Alter Rebbe was a Balkeira, and he would read the Parsha. That year the Alter Rebbe had to travel. Someone else read it. So he says, when the Tata leint, when my father reads, I hear only blessings. Because the negatives, the klolos, are really blessings, but you have to know how to read it. That even in the negative, it's really a positive. Like we said before about the Yetzer Hara. But now someone else read it. That's what caused them to faint. And I'll conclude with one more story where the Alter Rebbe and the Mitteler Rebbe were once home. They lived, I think, in the same building, perhaps. And the Mitteler Rebbe was immersed in learning, as was the Alter Rebbe. And a baby fell out of a crib, started crying. The Alter Rebbe went and soothed the baby. And he saw the Mitteler Rebbe was oblivious, because he was so immersed in learning. And the Alter Rebbe rebuked him and said, Kel yelad becha, a kind veint. So even learning Torah, such a high madrega, you could say L'mal Yus, it's such a quality. No, but never to lose your sensitivity. So Chaz v'Shalom to say the Mitteler Rebbe was not sensitive, we know from these stories I shared and others, it's very sensitive. But everything lefiyerach, that sometimes you have to remember when you're connected with God, do not neglect to hear the cry of a child, your child or another child. So this is all the schus tests and Yud Kislev. And with that, may the Mitteler Rebbe's schusim be a blessing to all of us. And going from the Edison and the Yortzeit, the Yemistalkus, Yemilula into the Geula, should come to this Geula to the Geula Amitis Vashlem. And with that, my friends, let's go over to the regular schedule, Tanya. We're at the end of chapter 9, the last lines of chapter 9 in Tanya. And indeed, the theme here is actually a part of one of the stories I just shared, helps us understand the end of Tanya chapter 9. But let's not jump ahead of ourselves. So let's learn inside. So what are we up to here? So we're up to now talking about, let's just sum up what we've learned. This entire chapter was like a summation, in a way, conclusion of the whole section that we learned in chapters 2, 3, and 4. We learned about what? 2, 3, 4, and 5, I should say. But the Nefesh Alekis, the divine soul, and its koiches, its faculties, and its levushim, its garments. Then in chapters 6, 7, and 8, we learned about the Nefesh Habamis, the animal soul, its personality, its faculties, and its garments, all focused on its own interests, in contrast to the divine soul focused on God's interests and the purpose of life. And there's a battle between them. And that's what chapter 9 was about, the battle. Two nations within you. Like we just read in the Parsha. The two nations within you, two forces, Yaakov and Esav, Zelu Umazeh, equally equipped, and each wants control over the city. What's the city? The small city, the human body, you and I, and all our faculties. And he explained at length with a moshel how that battle takes place. But the goal of each of the sides is to completely conquer and transform the city to be under that one's control. But there's a lot of stages, because it's not just control, you want them to do it willingly, to the point of transforming even the adversity, even the adversaries should also become allies. So we've been elaborating on the king called the Nefesh Alekis, the divine soul, how its entire focus is what? Is to transform the person, all of the person, the entire city, to follow what the divine soul wants, which is to connect to a God and to connect it to its higher purpose. We went through the whole thing, all the different levels. First, it's subduing the animal soul. then it's affecting the animal soul, impacting until it transforms. We learned about 2 levels of Ava. The first begins on Ava Kirish Be'esh, a passionate, fiery Ava that feels the distance and therefore longs to connect to godliness. And that has an impact on the animal soul. And then a deeper and higher level of Ava, what he calls Ava Rabba, the Chibi Yesera, which is Ava B'tainugim, pleasurable Ava, like water, not like fire. And that ultimately has the true power of total transformation. And that's the last thing we learned about that transformation, how it transforms the water, which is the source of pleasures of the animal soul, is transformed by the water of the calm, pleasurable love of the divine soul, as we elaborated at length. And that einig, tainugim, is b'moyach, chochma, v'seichel, ha-mesanik ba'askolas Hashem v'diyosei. That's ir zerua shebektushas nefesh alekis. I'm just reading the last lines that we read in the previous weeks. Okay? And that is ha-mesapeches l'teiv as p'chinas hamayim shebenefesh habamis. Transforms to good the waterly pleasures of the animal soul. Shemehem bo taivas tainug elam hazeh mitchila. And then he continued the last lines we learned. He quoted from Eitz Chaim the name of the Zohar. Shara nepach liyes tev gomur kama yetzer tev mamish. Yetzer tev mamish. Now we'll soon learn what the yetzer tev's intentions are. And that will help understand how you can transform it. Because remember, the animal soul is not evil. The animal soul is part of God's mission as well. And we'll soon learn that its intentions is actually to bring out the best in us. It challenges us to bring out the best in us. Like we spoke before in the story of the Mitteler Rebbe. So the challenge is, how do we take the animal soul's drive and passions and redirect them? Instead of to worldly matters, should be directed to divine pleasures. It's still pleasure. And the animal soul likes pleasure, but teach the animal soul that the greatest pleasure is godly pleasures. And that's when the Ran Nepachli is Tev Gomer Kama Yetzu Tev Mamish. But how do you do that? By removing the defiled garments. Because remember, the animal soul has dressed up in such garments. The soiled garments, Shem Tanuga Elam Hazeh Shehu Melubish Behem, which are the pleasures of this world in which the animal soul is clothed. So it's about redirecting and taking in the city, the small city, even that which was initially an enemy has now been transformed into an ally. Not just neutralized, not just subdued, but into an ally. And that's where we stopped. So let's continue now. Remember, we're talking about conquering the whole city. Total transformation, not just part. So far we've really spoken, if you talked about midas and the faculties, we've spoken about yira and ava, the 2 levels of ava. What about the other midas, the other faculties of the person? We've also spoken about the moichin, the chabad, by contemplating about God, chochma bina das. This was all earlier in the chapter. So we've covered Chachma Bina Das, we've covered Chesed and Gvura, Ava and Yira. How about the other midas? So that's what the Alter Rebbe says. No, the conquest has to be complete. You can't leave anything untouched. Everything has to be transformed. So he says, V'chein shar kol hamidas shebelev. And so too, just as it is with Chesed and Gvura, Ava and Yira, or Yira and Ava in the order that he explained it as we discussed, he says, the same as so too, the divine soul desires, which is the king fighting this battle, that the other emotions of the heart, Shein Shar Kol Midas Shebelev, and what are they? Shehein Anfei Hayira Va'ava. They're derivatives, they're branches of Yira and Ava, of reverence and love. As he said back in Perek Gimel, he mentioned that clearly in Perek Gimel, chapter 3, that they too, Yir LeHashem Levadeh, be devoted exclusively to God. So he's not going to speak in detail what that is. We did speak about Tiferes a bit earlier in the previous prokim and also in this Perek. The grandeur, the beauty, the majesty of God. But he suffices by covering it because you have to cover every faculty. It should be L'Hashem levadei, not just L'Hashem, nothing else, exclusively, because we don't want to leave room for anything that is possible. Even if it's neutral, it's not good enough. Okay. So these offshoots now of Ava V'yira, of now all the other faculties, the emotions. But we still have to cover one more thing. How about Levushim? Perek Dalet and Hey talked at length about garments. As later chapters, Vov and Zayin talked about the garments of the animal soul. What about garments? So now, the divine soul is not just occupying. I don't know what the word occupying is the right word. It's not just transforming the emotions, the faculties, but also the expression of the faculties, as we learn thought, speech, and action. So here's what he says. V'kol ke'ech hadibur shebapeh. And all the words in the mouth of the person. V'amachshava shebemeach. And the thoughts in your mind. We're talking about active thoughts, not just the mind. We're talking about active machshava. Yiyu mumulim min levushe ha-machshava v'adibur shal nefesh halikis levada. That they should be dressed and clothed exclusively with the thought and speech of the divine soul. As we learned earlier what that means. Thinking about God and His Torah, as he's going to say in a moment. Shemachshavas Hashem v'teirosei, thoughts of God and His Torah. And in dibur liyas sichosei kol hayom lo posek pumeh megirsa. And in speech, there should be topics of the conversation all day, so that the mouth never ceases from study. Why is the Alter Rebbe speaking such a high level? Not just Perek Echad Shachris, Perek Echad Arvis. Because he wants it to be completely filled. Remember, the king wants the entire city, not one detail, not no iota should be outside of the realm of his dominion, of his sovereignty. So it permeates both Machshav and Dibur completely. What about Maisa? Then he goes on, V'koyach ha-maisi shebiyodov. Every action in his hands, V'shar ha-machevorov, as well as the other anatomical parts of the body, which are 248 in number, Yir b'maisa ha-mitzvahs levad. Should be only exclusively dedicated to performing mitzvahs, shehu levush hashlishi shel nefesh halikis. That maisa is the third garment, which concludes all the 10 faculties, and the third garment as well of action. The third garment of the divine is now controlled completely by the divine soul. So there you have it. That's the story of what the divine soul wants to accomplish, dealing with the entire person from head to toe, with the garments, all focused on the divine. The next section, I thought I was going to conclude, it's just few more lines, that Alter Rebbe dedicates just a few lines, but he has to cover the other side. What does the animal soul want? But here, I'm going to wait till next week to finish it. But here we're going to learn, but not just what the animal soul wants, but learn something, a secret about the animal soul that teaches us a whole new dimension of understanding this battle in a very powerful way. But that will leave for next week. And that's when we'll conclude chapter 9. So everyone have a very good Tavach. Again, may the Yom Haledes, Yom Elula, and Chag HaGeula serve us all well. All these programs can be found at TanyaApplied.com. And also you can submit any of your questions there. Be well, Kol Tuv.
This has been My Life, Tanya Applied with Rabbi Simon Jacobson. Please join us again next week. Visit ChasidusApplied.com for archived classes and more resources.